And welcome all of our attendees to this week's webinar. First of all, as Melissa suggested, great pre-registrations for this week. So now that we're into the swing of the school year, I can tell you, and I don't want to embarrass our guests, but we've had more registrations for this webinar than we have for any of them since school started. So very, very excited to have so many of you joining us here this afternoon. And thanks as always to Melissa for that introduction and for producing our show today. So let's get started. We'll dive right in. We're talking today about a credential for every course. Is it possible that we could literally have a separate third-party credential for every course in a community college program, in a technical college program, or for that matter, in a high school? And we'll be learning a little bit more about that as the day goes on. You know, this whole world of third-party certifications was new to me when I came over from manufacturing into the world of education. And about 2 years ago, when we were approached about working with our customers to build out a series of certifications along with others all over the United States and really all over the world, we had a lot of questions ourselves. And so rather than assuming we had all the answers, we started working with our customers and talking to our customers about third-party credentials, about whether they had value, about how they were using them. And it became really clear to me early on that almost every one of our educators that we talked to were certainly open to discussions, but also had some beliefs and some objections to this whole idea of certifications. I'm going to cover them with you really quickly and then go back one by one and explain what I mean by them. The first one is my industrial employers don't value them. The second thing we heard from our customers about certifications is they're just a tool for companies to sell more equipment. By the way, I should interrupt myself and tell you this is running like a David Letterman top 10 list. So it goes from number 6 down to number 1. Number 4 is certifications are designed so that the people who offer them can just make a bunch of money. The third objection that we heard from our customers was that they are too expensive for our students. The second objection was that our industries are different. And the first objection is that they don't match my course competencies. So let's explore these just a little bit and really quickly. The first one, my industrial employers don't value third-party credentials. I can tell you, as somebody who ran industrial companies, as someone who was a chief executive of 2 manufacturing companies, and the chief operating officer of a third one, that one a high-tech company, that this idea that industrial employers don't value third-party credentials is absolutely true. I was in manufacturing, as I said, for 23 years, and I knew about one certification. I knew about the NIMS certification. Some of you may be familiar with that. We ran a metal fabricating company, hired a lot of machinists. And then I got over to the world of education, and there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these third-party certifications. I had no idea all these existed. And I can tell you, as an industrial employer, I did not place a lot of value on certifications because I didn't see the competencies coming from manufacturing. We'll talk about that as the day goes on. Number 5, they're just a tool for companies to sell more equipment. In many, if not most cases, that is true. If you look at the competencies in most certifications, they are tied directly to, surprise, surprise, what we are teaching on a specific company's product. So when we talk about third-party certifications, it's important to understand which ones are based around equipment and which ones are based around the competencies associated with them. These should be a pathway for students to amazing careers, not just a tool or a pathway for employers or companies to sell more equipment. The certifications are designed so the people who offer them make a bunch of money. This one I can tell you in some cases is also true. About 30 years ago, to see if I could pass it, I sat for the CPA exam. I passed the CPA exam. So in another life, I was a certified public accountant. I know my way around a nonprofit tax return. If you look at the 990 tax returns from some of these organizations, you would be shocked at how much money some of these folks are making. In some cases, more than $750,000 a year. Where do I sign up for that job? But they're not all like that, and we should chat about that. Number 3, they are too expensive for our students. What I say is that we cannot make our money on the backs of students. That is not the purpose of a certification. They should be a pathway to a great career, like I said, not a pathway to anything else. Number 2, our industries are different. I am up in northwestern North Dakota, and I'm teaching students who are going into the fracking industry. We are not teaching advanced robotics. We don't need our students to know that, but they need to know electric motor control, or they need to know process control. So The objection is, how do we match a certification to the individual industries in our territory or in our region or district? And finally, I already have course competencies in my courses. I already have a course sequence. Why should I be teaching to somebody else's set of competencies? I have my own competencies. I don't want to adjust my course, which is tied to our industrial employers, just so I can match somebody's competencies. That is a great objection as well, and makes a lot of sense. For number 2 and number 1, I want to turn to the whole world of the 7 deadly wastes. Some of you know I write the monthly leadership columns for Production Machining and Products Finishing magazines every single month. And so every single month I come up with a new topic. This was the one for, believe it or not, 12 years ago, the 1st of October of 2008, where we talked about the 7 deadly wastes. The 7 deadly wastes, if you're not familiar, are waiting, rework, overproduction, overprocessing, transportation, motion, I'm missing one, inventory. Good, I got all 7 of them without looking, so I'm still on my game. Waiting, motion, rework, transportation, overproduction, inventory, and overprocessing. The one I want to talk about today is overprocessing, probably the least understood of the 7 deadly wastes. Overprocessing is doing more than your customer requires. When I was writing for people in the finishing industry, I said, look, if your customer requires an electrical contact to have 300 microinches of tin on it, and you are putting 600 microinches of tin on it, you're giving away 300 microinches of tin. That is value your customer isn't willing to pay for. Another is providing a level of aesthetic quality that is beyond what the customer specifies or is willing to pay for. And so we need to take care to only add those costs that translate themselves into something of value for the customer. What does this have to do with education? What does this have to do in a discussion about certifications? And here's your answer. In skills and career training, overprocessing is a waste that puts us in a position where we are equipping our students with competencies that our employers don't value. If our employer doesn't want the competency, if our market, if our stakeholders don't value that competency, and we are instilling, and they're not paying for it, by the way, and we are instilling that competency in our students, that is overprocessing. That is waste. That is one of the 7 deadly wastes identified all the way back in the 1950s by Ono when he created the Toyota production system. So the question for us today on this whole topic of micro-credentials is, can educators avoid this overprocessing waste using micro-credentials? Can we still offer our students or our industrial learners a third-party credential that ties really, really close to the competencies that are already embedded in our program, so that we don't have to change our program to meet the certification? We can literally change the certification to meet the program. So my guest this afternoon is one of my very favorite people, Jim Wall. I've gotten to know Jim really, really well over the course of the last 2 years. Full disclosure, I serve on his national board, but only because he is doing things that are really, really innovative in the world of Industry 4.0 certifications. Jim is the executive director of the Smart Automation Certification Alliance. Some of you may know Jim from his time with the National Institute for Metalworking Skills. He helped founded that organization and was its executive director for quite some time. So Jim, what a pleasure to have you joining us here this afternoon. Thanks so much for taking some time to talk to our audience about micro-credentials.
Sure, Matt, thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity to visit with you today.
Absolutely. So we're gonna jump right in to keep things moving. Our attendees know we like to keep these webinars to around a half an hour, give or take, to make great use of their time. So we're gonna jump right into our first question. And this whole idea of having a credential for every course and using micro-credentials to do that, Jim, what is a micro-credential exactly, and why would SACA, or for that matter, an educator, deploy them in their programs?
Well, in our world, a micro-credential really came from our first technical work group, which are industry experts that we empaneled to help develop the SACA standards and then certifications. And in the very first meeting, you know, a number of the industry leaders discussed that how useful it would be if we could develop this system that was very modular in nature, and decided that as a rule of thumb, if we could break things down into competency areas that someone could be trained on and go through a certification program in roughly 40 hours or less, that really was a sweet spot in the industry. You know, they said over and over again, you know, it's going to be much easier for us to send people for training for a week at a time and have them get the certification versus having to enroll in a program for, you know, a full semester or even sometimes like a 2-year program. You know, that really doesn't work real well in industry. So we use the term micro-credentials to sort of define that small credential that doesn't cover the whole occupation, but covers parts of it. And then those micro-credentials can be stacked together in many different ways, depending on the person's career path and what industry they're in.
And so you know how important it is to me to have industrial employers behind a credential. It shouldn't be about equipment. It shouldn't be about competencies that somebody else came up with. It should be about industrial employers. And so you listen to those industrial employers in terms of coming up with this idea of a micro-credential. Talk a little bit about how then taking that information that you learned from industry and creating micro-credentials, how does that benefit our educators?
Well, you know, one thing that these micro-credentials, again, break things down into, you know, smaller, more bite-sized chunks. And we found that it's much easier for the education community to embed those micro-credentials in specific courses. And in many cases, they might have to adjust some of the competencies in those individual courses, but they don't have to necessarily develop new courses. We recognized early on that if our system was not flexible enough and didn't allow for that granularity to be embedded in individual courses, if organizations would need to add new courses, and in some states that is a 2 or 3 year process to get new courses approved and on the books. And you know, our industry partners who are driving us, you know, need people with these Industry 4.0 skills now. So, you know, we see it as a huge advantage to have this whole series of micro-credentials that can more easily fit in with things people are already doing, and you know, obviously have to make some adjustments, but it's more of an incremental move rather than trying to have a, you know, a full-blown certification that covers a full occupation that is difficult to cover in you know, 1 or 2 courses.
And so speaking of incremental moves, obviously the incremental move for a student once they are working through these educational pathways is to move toward a career that is rewarding and that is in their area of subject interest and so on. When it comes to that career, and as those young people or incumbent workers for that matter are approaching industrial employers, why would you say that the industrial employers like micro-credentials so much? And as you answer this question, I'm just going to scroll through the logos of some of the industrial employers that I know have served and supported your work and your technical work groups.
Well, certainly you know, one thing we know is that industry doesn't want to train and pay for things that people might not need and might not be doing, you know, right now on the job. So the whole idea of having these micro-credentials is to have that flexibility so companies can do short-term training for their individuals, you know, so they might have an experienced worker who, and they're now moving to install smart sensors on equipment on the plant floor. So many of their technicians can just focus on just that smart sensor technology and be able to get a certification and demonstrate their competence, and then go onto the plant floor and use those technologies effectively. So it really provides that flexibility for companies to get what they need when they need it, and not have to spend time and effort to do things that they don't need right away.
And so that efficiency and that angle of looking at things the way that an industrial employer would is so very, very important. And so let's make sure that folks are getting the competencies that are valued by industrial employers on a real-time basis. And so that led to this whole idea, as I understand it, of micro-credentials. Now, if I think about all the different competencies in industry that are important, whether it's programming a programmable logic controller, understanding AC/DC circuits, understanding motor control, basic robotics, Ethernet. There's a lot of content there. And so trying to figure out how we align specific micro-credentials to those competencies has to be quite a challenge. As I bring up this next slide, I want to first invite our educators to take a look at the examples of micro-credentials and think about how they might align to specific courses. And as SACA and other organizations continue to build out a field of micro-credentials based around smaller bits of competencies, how we might align a specific course to those competencies and to those credentials, which is really the topic of our discussion today. But as we look at these, Jim, how did you and your organization decide which credentials and which micro-credentials should be released first out of all of the different competencies that are important to industry?
Well, again, that came from our technical work group, which were industry experts from many of those companies that you showed on a previous slide. Those individuals came together and met multiple times to help develop our standards and then our certification program. And it was the company representatives who indicated that, you know, one of their really burning needs right now and moving forward was for more automation system specialist technicians. And so that was an area that we recognized and listened to the industry and saying that's what we need to prioritize and move forward on first. We've got a lot of other development happening with other credentials at other levels. So, but you know, we really listened to the company representatives because if the program is going to work, it has to be recognized and valued by the industry folks. So, you know, we're really trying to meet their needs as much as possible.
And on that topic of listening to industry, Jim, I can tell you that one of the most rewarding parts about what I do in my job and what my colleagues get to do is we work with educators all over the Midwest and in some cases all over the country as they look at the course competencies for their coursework, especially as it relates to advanced manufacturing in Industry 4.0, sitting in on DACMs, attending advisory board meetings, attending listening sessions, and so on. One of the things that we hear more often than anything is about this whole idea of the convergence between information technology and operations technology, that our IT people more and more are being pulled out onto the manufacturing floor to understand and to integrate IT solutions right against the manufacturing equipment. And more that people in manufacturing have to understand IT and information technology, and in some cases, cybersecurity and network security, and how they can get themselves into trouble, or more important, stay out of trouble. So as we look at this whole convergence between the people on the operations side of a manufacturing operation, the people on the IT side of an industrial operation, talk about how micro-credentials can be used to fill the gap between IT and OT.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, with the whole Industry 4.0 revolution that we're in now, you know, we're really seeing a convergence of the cyber world and the physical world, and you know, that's happening really in all industries, but in manufacturing in particular, you know, there is really a huge need for both the operations folks and the IT folks to have more of a common skill set in terms of dealing with some of these Industry 4.0 technologies. So, you know, for the information technology folks who in years past, you know, primarily were in the office and managing networks and those kinds of things. Now they're increasingly being called down to the plant floor to configure smart sensors and other data acquisition tools and in the back of the equipment. And in many cases, they have not had any safety training or even electrical training. And so there is a potential problem there. But also, you know, the industry representatives understand that their frontline workers also need to understand how the data analytics and how the whole system works. So there is a need for folks on both sides of the equation, whether it's operations or IT, to get more of a blended skill set. And by having these micro-credentials, it really allows them to do things incrementally and maybe have some of the IT folks really learn some of the basic operations so they get a better understanding of what the whole picture is in terms of, you know, the advanced manufacturing environment today. and also for the operations folks and manufacturing folks to learn some of the basic skills that they need in terms of the IT competencies. So by having these micro-credentials, it really allows them to really provide for short-term training and build people's skill sets over time.
And helps them communicate with each other as well, right? So the operations folks know how to talk to an information technology person, and an IT person understands how to talk with an OT person, so they can improve processes and solve problems together. So in the past, those were two different languages that are now becoming one. I can tell you two other different languages are the whole world of industrial language and speaking and education language and speaking. And I feel like in the 5 years that I've spent transitioning from the industrial world into the education world, that I had to learn an entirely different language. It would take me a half an hour just to share all the different new words that I've learned since coming over to the education side. But let me tell you one of them, and that is that I had never heard the term stackable referred to in terms of a competency or a credential before. Tell our audience a bit about what it means for a micro-credential to be stackable.
Well, you know, the whole system is designed to be granular and flexible, so that, you know, we recognize one size doesn't necessarily fit all. But if we go back to, you know, our technical work group, one of the occupations that they decided that we really should focus on was the occupation of automation system specialist. Now that occupational designation is made up of 16 core micro-credentials that if someone wanted to get the designation as a SACA certified automation system specialist 1, they would need to complete all 16 of those micro-credentials. But, you know, everyone's not going to want to get that occupational designation. You know, there's it could be people who've been working in the industry for years, but they really need to get some training on some of these new technologies, and they could just do those certifications and earn those micro-credentials, and they stand on their own, but also they can be combined to represent different occupations. I like to use the analogy that the micro-credentials really are like ingredients that you would have in your kitchen, and depending on how you combine them, you can bake a lot of different cakes. So those micro-credentials can be used many different ways depending on the individual, their career path, the companies that they're with, and companies can use them in different ways within their organizations as well.
So as far as the companies and how they use them, certainly one way would be to have their incumbent worker sitting for their incumbent employees sitting for those certifications. And I will admit that I'm a product of that. We practice what we preach, and we're a continuous learning company. Our entire team earlier this year, Jim, sat through your automation specialist, your associate 1 certification, and went through the learning program, sat for that certification. I'm proud to announce that I'm actually a holder of the Certified Industry 4.0 Associate Basic Operations certification, and I'm currently working on the second one for the Associate 2 certification, and plan to sit for that this fall, as does the rest of our team. So I'm a product of your program and your system, and can tell you that you know, obviously we're very strong believers in the work that you're doing. I put some examples up here of what I received when I received my certification, but talk about how an individual that holds a micro-credential, holds a certification, has earned it as part of a program in their community or technical college program, has earned it somehow elsewhere. How do they use that when they're approaching prospective employers and showing those employers that they have these credentials?
Well, certainly, you know, we've designed a system to enable them to show that they've got their certification on multiple social media platforms. You know, probably one of the biggest ones that employers use would be LinkedIn. And on your slide there, you notice that there is a validation number that they can actually put on their LinkedIn profile. So an employer could actually come to our website and verify that that individual did actually earn the credentials that they're showing. And it is, you know, companies are looking with people with Industry 4.0 skills, and the SACA certifications are relatively new, but by being able to very easily upload their certifications into their LinkedIn profile, it really is going to make those individuals stand out in the crowd as companies search for individuals with Industry 4.0 technologies competency. So we really encourage folks to do that as much as possible.
And as industries search for that, what a great opportunity for our educators to find ways to align your micro-credentials or micro-credentials in general with individual courses within their course sequence. And so as we turn the discussion over to Melissa here in just a moment to talk about, to see what questions came over from our audience during our discussion, just a reminder to everybody that's on this afternoon that there are great opportunities for you to take a look at your course sequence and then take specific courses and find where the SACA certifications align to your competencies in your courses and have your students sit for those specific course exams, assuming again that you're a SACA member, which is incredibly affordable and not difficult to become one. So with that, Melissa, would be very interested in hearing what questions came over from our audience attendees today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And to all of our attendees, if you do have any questions that you haven't yet submitted, you can do that using that Q&A button on your Zoom control panel. First question that we got, is there anything my college needs to do to assemble a group of micro-credentials into a certification that matches my program objectives?
No, our whole system is designed to be flexible and adaptable. There are no prerequisites, so you can pick and choose through the list of micro-credentials. We encourage you to sit down with your local employers and see what fits both your program and your local industry's needs, and you can pick and choose exactly what you are able to do. You don't have to do everything. It's out there, and we'd like people to try to do that, but it really is designed to be a totally flexible system that you can use as you need it in terms of mixing and matching those credentials to match what your industry folks need. And having these micro-credentials are really also a real advantage. We know a lot of colleges do customized training for companies, and by having that flexibility to have a micro-credentials that could be part of many times those customized training opportunities for companies, I think really just helps to enhance the program offerings from the various colleges.
Thanks, Jim. Next question that came through says, I've heard the terms badging and nano degrees. What makes SACA MicroCredentials different from these?
Well, those terms really are synonymous. We chose to use the term microcredential. Some people in other organizations use badging or nano degrees. There is no standard definition across the industry. So, we have defined a microcredential as, again, that grouping of competencies that's revolve around a specific technology that someone could potentially be trained on in 40 hours or less. That's our rule of thumb definition for the microcredential. Badging and nano degrees have similar definitions depending on the different organizations.
Excellent. So I'm just looking at some of the other questions that have come in. It looks like this individual is just letting us know that they're implementing SACA credentials within their current curriculum and developing or modifying curricula to align with SACA. That's excellent to hear. Thank you for sharing that with us. What are the costs associated with microcredential certification, registration, sitting for assessments, etc.?
Well, we've decided early on to make it as streamlined as possible. So for an educational organization to become a member of the SACA Alliance, the cost is pretty straightforward. For a college, it's $2,500 a year. For a high school program, it's $500 a year. We're actually running special COVID pricing right now through December 31st that makes that even more affordable. But once a school is a member of the Alliance, there's no incremental cost for credentialing. Any student, any person who's going doing credentialing through that school does it through the school at no cost to the individual. It's just that the school, or if it's a company, we have company industrial memberships as well, need to have that annual membership fee, and then there's no incremental cost for the certification. So it really is designed to be as efficient as possible and have the certifications be free to the individuals. And we recognize that if we can take that financial transaction away from the students, more likely more students are going to sit for the certification, and that's our goal, is to get certified people out into the industry.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Matt, it looks like that's it for our questions for this afternoon so far. Again, for our attendees, if you have additional questions or you want to have a conversation with us one-on-one outside of this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. You can just respond to that follow-up email. For now, I'll leave it to Matt to wrap things up for us today.
Thank you, Melissa. And just to kind of put the finishing touch on Jim's great answer right there, I know everybody heard him say that the certifications are free to students and learners if their employer or their educational institution is a member of the Alliance. So every single certification that is earned by a student, that student earns that absolutely free of charge, which I know is really, really important to me in terms of how we look at the adequate business model for an organization like SACA. So speaking of getting great value for free, we like to think that we do exactly that on these webinars every Wednesday. I want to just give you a preview of some of the great ones we've got lined up for the next several weeks. Joining me next week will be Mark Goodman. Mark is an expert in creating industrial training programs. And we're going to talk about, in this world of, Jim mentioned the world of COVID, we have so many people that are being dislocated out of jobs in areas like hospitality or retail, dining, and are now unemployed and trying to figure out how they give themselves the requisite skills to work in another industry. We're going to talk about, can we take people who are working in those sectors and move them over into manufacturing? And how do we do that to help solve the shortage of skilled labor in manufacturing? On the 7th of October, this is just a really cool presentation. Mike Bigley, who's the superintendent of Whitehall School District in Western Wisconsin, will join me. They are using technology to create what they are calling a pandemic-proof model for learning. Literally pandemic-proof. It doesn't matter if the teacher is at home or at school. It doesn't matter if the student is at home or at school, or any combination. In some cases, it doesn't even matter what school district that student is in. That student can continue learning, and the teachers can continue teaching through the use of technology. That will be a great one you don't want to miss. On the 14th of October, I will be joined by Steve Harrington. Steve is the industry liaison for the National Center for Supply Chain Automation. He is a nationally recognized figure on the topic of automating supply chains and supply chain technology. Also joining us for that will be the president of Amatrol, Paul Perkins, and the CEO of the Manufacturing Skills Council, Leo Reddy, who is the CEO of that organization. And it's actually his son, Neil, who's joining us for that presentation. And then on October 21st, for those of you interested in metal 3D printing, I traveled to State College, Pennsylvania about 9 months ago and met a company that is doing amazing things in the world of metal 3D printing, literally printing product in metal. We're going to be joined by their CEO and their commercial operations leader. The company is called Exact Metal, and that is on the 21st of October. So looking forward to seeing you next week when Mark Goodman joins us to talk about industrial training, and really appreciate everybody being on with us today. We will see you next week.